So recently, I posted a video to my YouTube about a trip that my partner and I took to Mount Shasta in Northern California. And in that video, a lot of people were asking which picture profile I use for my Sony camera and or if I could walk through my color grading process. And now, although recently I've started to make the switch to using DaVinci Resolve, I still use Premiere Pro quite a bit, especially when something has a quick turnaround and or I need to get something up to YouTube or Instagram rather quickly. So in today's video, I want to talk about which settings and picture profile I use specifically on my Sony a7 III and how I grade my SLOG-2 footage in Adobe Premiere Pro. So first off, let's start talking about how you would go about setting up SLOG-2 on your Sony a7 III. Now this part is rather simple. When in the menu, you have the option to select your picture profile, and when you purchase a Sony camera, the standard setting is usually picture profile 7 is SLOG-2, and picture profile 8 is SLOG-3. Now, I tried both of these at the beginning stages of owning this camera and felt like the contrast and the color I got from SLOG-2 suited my needs much better than SLOG-3. Now, so once you have this selected, you'll notice your image looks much more washed out than it did before. This is because you're now shooting in a profile that allows you to capture a much higher dynamic range from the sensor than you could before. Essentially, you're allowing yourself more flexibility to toy around with contrast and saturation in post, whereas the standard Sony profile provides you with a more complete looking image with all that saturation and contrast already baked into the image. One thing to remember when shooting in SLOG-2 is that you have to overexpose your image quite a bit more than you would normally. This is to preserve detail in the shadows. You can always bring your overall exposure down in post as long as nothing is clipped, but trying to raise an extremely dark log image can be difficult and noisy with these cameras. And this is a whole nother topic that I could probably cover in another video, but for now, let's just move on. So now that we have our picture profile selected, let's jump into Premiere Pro where I can show you how I approach my color grading process. Great, so here we are in Adobe Premiere Pro, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how I get started with color grading. So what I've done here is I've grabbed a couple of clips from this Mount Shasta video that I mentioned earlier. Let's say this is a finished sequence, so I kind of want to go over how I would start something like this. So let's go ahead and start by adding an adjustment layer, and I have some here, but we can even just do a new one. We'll create a new adjustment layer, and this is set to UHD 4K. And I will just drag this right onto my timeline and I will stretch it out over all the clips. And then what I do right at the beginning is I'll make a couple of copies. I'll do at least 3, if not more, and then I'll rename them. The first one I will name LUT 1. And next one, let's go ahead and do LUT 2. And the third one, I usually say global or final adjustment, whatever you want to call it. We can just call it global. Great, so now that we found our hero shot, what I'll usually start with is adding a conversion LUT, so something that converts the image from its log form to a closer to Rec 709 form. So I'll make sure I have my bottom layer selected, LUT 1. And this is Sony a7 III footage, so it's 8-bit color. You can't stretch it super far, although shooting in log, SLOG-2 does allow for a lot of flexibility. There's a ton of conversion LUTs out there, and I ended up finding that none of them really worked exactly how I wanted them to work. So what I ended up doing was going into DaVinci Resolve and creating my own conversion LUT. And essentially, it's just something that adds a punch of contrast and saturation that I need to get my image started. So what I'll do is I'll provide you with this LUT that I've created in the description below just to help you kind of get your S-Log footage a little bit closer to where it needs to be. This isn't going to fix all your problems, but hopefully it'll get you started. Great, so you can already see that this image is looking a lot closer to where we want it to be. And obviously we're going to need to fix some white balance issues, some tint issues, exposure, things like that. But I already like where it is right now. So what I would do is to make any specific adjustments now to this clip, and I'm saying to this clip because we have these adjustment layers over our entire timeline, so anything we do, it's going to affect all of these clips, correct? So what I want to do is I want to make specific adjustments to just this clip. So I'll click on this, and let's say we'll go to basic correction, and it's a little bit green in my opinion, so we'll bump up the tint to magenta just by, let's say 4, that's looking better. And I'm sorry, I don't have my scopes up. Let's bring our scopes up. So always use your scopes. This is just to help because not everybody uses the same monitors. So this gives you an idea of what you should be looking out for. So we got it a little bit closer to where we want it to be. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast just to stretch out that middle there. And I'm going to pull the blacks up just a little bit. And I'm going to pull the highlights down just a little bit. And the exposure can also come down just a tiny bit. So notice that I did these adjustments on the clip itself. This is because I don't want these adjustments to be made over everything, meaning I don't want this layer, the adjustment layer, to make this adjustment over all of my clips. So now what I have is I have the local adjustments to this clip, and then I have a LUT applied to the entire timeline. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to LUT 2, and what I usually do is I apply a secondary LUT. And this is sort of just to get the look and the feel across for what I'm trying to do usually. And what I've done is I've downloaded many LUTs from various filmmakers and artists from all over the internet. But one that I particularly love and I used on this project was by Film Riot. And it's the Triune Films, I think, Cinematic LUT Pack Volume 1, one of the earlier ones that they created. So I have them all loaded up in here. I'll make sure to link that as well below. But one that I really particularly love is called The Walking Dead, and it's a Rec. 709 LUT. And it won't make it look like The Walking Dead, I'll tell you that right now. But let's click on it and see what it does. So right off the bat, it does make a pretty significant adjustment. It's not exactly what I would want it to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this intensity knob down all the way. I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to slowly slide up until I kind of find that sweet spot. So right around there, 66.7, let's just round up to 70, is about where I want it to be. And all I'm going to do on this layer is apply that LUT. And I'm going to jump back down to the clip now, and I'm going to basic correction, and I'm going to just make a couple of more adjustments just to fine tune it a little bit more to where I want it to be. Bring the highlights down. Blacks can come up just a tiny bit. Okay, that's looking a lot better. And then let's bring these shadows down. Great, so that's looking a lot closer to where I want it to be. So now what you'll notice is I made a LUT 1 adjustment and a LUT 2 adjustment. So now all of my clips have, you know, the Rec. 709 conversion LUT applied, and then also this Film Riot LUT that I have applied. And for the most part, it gives you the general look and feel. If you've exposed your footage properly, it'll get you generally to where you want it to be. It's a really good start, but not everything is set in stone. As you can see, things need to match, things need to be fine-tuned a little bit. So what I would do now is I would go clip by clip and make little small adjustments. So we can jump to this one, and we can look. I can bring it down a little bit, but unfortunately it is a little bit blown out in the footage, as you can see here by my Lumetri scopes. My waveform kind of starts to flatten out right there where the clouds are. So, you know, what I would do is I would bring as much detail back as I can, a little bit like that, and then add a little bit of contrast, maybe bump the shadows up a tiny bit, and then we can jump to the next clip. This one's actually pretty solid. I actually like where this one is a lot. Maybe I'll see if I can bump shadows up a tiny bit, maybe add a little bit of contrast, and then we'll go to the next one. This is one of my favorite shots in the entire video. So I'll probably just bring the exposure down a tiny bit, highlights down, shadows up, and let's bring the blacks up just a tiny bit. We still want some contrast. Okay, and then this one matches pretty well. I'll bring the exposure down a tiny bit. And the way I match this is I'll look at this and say, okay, the sky area is right around 80, a little bit above 80, in between 90 on the IRE. I'll jump to this one, and I'll kind of find a similar point right there. So now you can see these match pretty seamlessly when you jump back and forth. And this is a totally different day that we shot on, so this one's going to need its own treatment. And I'll bring it down probably right around there. Needs quite a bit of a contrast boost in my opinion. I want to save the shadows, but I also want to see a lot of the trees that we have down here. And I'll bring the blacks down a little bit. Great, so as you can see here, we've kind of found ourselves in a pretty good position. Although we're not done here, there's quite a bit of stuff that I would still add, but I just want to show you how I go about doing things and why I use these layers. And that's because Premiere Pro it's not like DaVinci Resolve where DaVinci Resolve is a node-based color grading software. This is more like Photoshop or something like that, where there's layers. So each time you add an adjustment layer or another layer of color correction, you're color correcting to the previous layer. So it's destructive. You're already color grading something, you're adding contrast, and then by adding another layer on top of that and decreasing the contrast, you're stretching the footage more than it can handle. So it's really important to kind of remember this like layer order of operations in terms of layers in Lumetri, in Adobe Premiere when using the Lumetri color panel, and that's so that you don't stretch your footage too far and it starts to break apart. So, you know, as you can see here in this shot, I've made most of my like contrast, and let's say, you know, if I was going to make my white balance corrections, I would do that all on the clip itself, and then I would just apply a general LUT on this first layer, general LUT, bring the intensity down on the second layer, and then the global one at the very end is where I do sort of finishing touches sort of things. So say if I wanted to add some contrast within the curves, I would do that here, all on the global, so give it a little bit of punch with the curves. If I was going to add a vignette, I would do that over the whole thing here, and then maybe a little bit of sharpening. You know, I would probably add about 15 on sharpening, and that applies to everything. So that's a global adjustment that's been made, and maybe if I wanted to be a little bit more vibrant sort of a piece, I could add that here, and that's going to apply to everything. Yeah, and so this is sort of my workflow in terms of color grading. It gets me to where I want to be, and when working with Sony 8-bit footage, it's a little bit easier to play with this and not stretch it too far to where the image starts to fall apart. So say with this shot in particular, when I edited this Mount Shasta video with this clip, I knew that I wanted to pull the yellow out quite a bit just to give it that little extra pop. So in that, I would come to curves. You can go to hue versus saturation down here, and then you can either, you know, select your yellow point, or you can just do that, and I would bump the saturation up quite a bit on the yellow. That gives it that layer of pop, and I kind of went and did that throughout the entire little short that I made, although I didn't do it the same amount on each one, so I made it more of a clip by clip adjustment. And then so in this one, I remember thinking that this was not the correct yellow that I wanted to see, so I would make a hue versus hue saturation here where I kind of pulled it, not too far, just a little bit more towards the orange. And there you go. And that's kind of the yellow that I was looking for. It's almost like a tangerine yellow, so you can see what I would do there. So as you can see, that's generally how I would color grade my project. I would use the Lumetri scopes clip by clip, make sure everything looks good, and kind of go through the entire piece like that. And that's how I would do something in Adobe Premiere Pro. Although lately, like I mentioned, I've been going into DaVinci Resolve quite a bit for my color grading. There is still definitely a time and place for using Adobe Premiere Pro, and I think that they're updating their features quite a bit and quite significantly to the point where it still does make sense to use Adobe Premiere time to time. So I hope this video has helped you understand a little bit about my workflow when color grading within Premiere Pro. If you have any further questions about this, feel free to drop them in the comments below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So if you want to stay up to date on my work, new videos, or other fun things like that, be sure to follow me on Instagram at TimmyLodi. And if you'd like to support me in this YouTube channel, be sure to jump down and subscribe below. That's all I have for today. I really appreciate your time and I'm looking forward to the next one. But until then, see you later. Bye.